Thank you all for coming today. For those of you who did not get the message, we did have to postpone the history of public housing. The director at the housing had another engagement come up, but she will get back on the schedule. But in the meantime, we're so happy to have Laurie Kearney having stepped in. She's going to be here talking about, very appropriately on Halloween, I might say.
You did it on
I know, I did it on purpose. I did it on purpose. She's going to talk about Walpole's historic cemeteries and how they tell the story of Walpole through who's buried there. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Deb. First of all, thank you for everybody for coming, and thank you to the Senior Center for inviting me to come and give you a presentation. My name is Laurie Kearney. I'm a local historian and genealogist and educator. And about 18 years ago, I decided to do a census of all of the cemeteries, recording what the stones looked like and how the stones read. And that census is on the Walpole Public Library webpage. Let's see. Here in Walpole, I do have a script, just to keep me on track, because if you know me, I could go around the corner and you'd be here till 5 p.m. So anyhow, the word cemetery, its etymology is Greek for dormitory, which implies that a cemetery is a place for dead to sleep. In fact, up until about 1800, a proper burial site had a headstone and a footstone, which kind of gives the look of a little bed. So here in Walpole, we have 11 cemeteries. 10 of them are historic burial grounds that were established in the 1700s. They're the Old Burial Ground, Rural Cemetery, Maple Grove, Morse Burial Ground, the Charles Sumner Bird Memorial Cemetery, which used to be the East Walpole Cemetery, Hartson Burial Tomb, Guild Family Cemetery, Terrace Hill Plains Cemetery, and the Blake Burial Ground. And the other cemetery that's not historic is St. Francis. And 4 of them are still in use today. That's Maple Grove and Terrace Hill and the Rural Cemetery, and then for St. Francis. Walpole cemeteries tell the history of our town. They're the resting place for families of our founders, our soldiers, our peacemakers, businessmen, but mostly the people buried here were farmers and laborers. As I was writing the cemetery walking tours that we just gave this past summer, I thought it would be an interesting way of presenting the cemeteries by mixing it with Walpole's history. So the Old Burial Ground is our oldest burial ground. It was established in 1705, almost 20 years before Walpole itself was established as a town. It's located at the corner of Kendall and Main Street, and many descendants of Walpole's founders are buried there. So it reflects the burial tradition of the early colonists, the Puritans, and the Pilgrims. They believed that they did not have to be buried in consecrated ground, in other words, a churchyard. And they also buried their dead in an east-west fashion and on a hill. That way, when the second coming of Christ rose in the eastern sky, they would be the first to see him coming, and they would rise up out of their graves and be taken to heaven. So they also didn't erect gravestones initially. So you won't find a gravestone that says 1620 on it. Dedham's earliest stone is 1673, and Medfield's earliest stone is 1661. If you study the landscape of the old burial ground here, you can see that it was indeed on a hill. They have dropped the grade of north of Kendall Street and Main Street so that it was easier to travel. And if you think about coming up Main Street, there is a rise there. It starts down at about North Street by the donut store, Country Kitchen, and it rises up to over here by about where the train tracks are. And then Kendall Street also goes up a hill. So this was probably the highest hill in the town in the early 1700s. The family of Thomas Clapp gave a half acre of land. It was his son Eleazar. And Eleazar's house still stands right next to the cemetery. So if you're coming up Main Street, there's this wonderful center entry colonial right next door. So he gave this, was a half an acre of land for the express purpose of it being used as a burial place. There's 152 headstones there. Most of them still have their original footstones. There's just under 200 people buried there, according to what is on the stone. But if anybody has ever tried to purchase a headstone today, you know they're very expensive. And they were equally expensive back in the 1700s. And most people, as I mentioned here in Walpole, were farmers or laborers. And so many people, I know there's more people buried here that the family just couldn't afford a headstone. The first burial was in 1704. It was Thomas Clapp, but the earliest gravestone is Mary Boyden Clapp in 1718. And the last burials occurred in 1863. Most of the gravestones are slate tablets, which was a stone that was plentiful here in New England, probably quarried in Quincy. The old burial ground has the largest collection of slate stones here in town that has a variety of symbols carved on them. So another fun fact, which I think is crazy, was around 1900, a really industrious cemetery worker decided to straighten out the stones. Initially, I'd heard that he placed them so they would look better, higher to lower. But I think what he did is he put them in perfect straight rows. So here is headstones, and these are the footstones. And some might be the footstone of a child. So you'd have the headstone here and the footstone here. And if an adult, the headstone would be here and the footstone would be some 5 feet away. And you can see that they're all perfectly in perfect rows. So when you're there and you're going to pay homage to someone, you might not be right where they're buried. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the iconography, the symbols that appear on the headstones. So we have James Smith up here. He has skull and crossbones. It's the only skull and crossbones headstone here in Walpole. And then this is, I think Mary is here. Here's Mary. This is the oldest headstone. She has a skull and wings, a winged skull, or death's head, which means is representative, and actually you can see the winged death head here as well, of dying. Then Robert Allen has a winged cherub. It's really a beautiful, these are all winged cherubs. Which also shows, I think, a change in religious belief. So early on, death was supposed to be bad. You wanted to make sure you led a good life so that you would be one of the chosen ones who went to heaven. And somewhere towards the late 1700s, we started to believe that we went directly to heaven. And so you still have this kind of a modified iconography of the winged cherub. And this fellow here, his headstone is really interesting because it has a Roman cross on it right there. It's one of 2 headstones in Massachusetts with a Roman cross on it. He was actually a really interesting person to trace. I thought he was part of the Acadians that came here for refuge in the 1700s. He was an Acadian, but he was not here during the refugee crisis. He died in Boston. I can't find any connection to Walpole, but here he is, born in Canada. Possibly spent some of his time down in the Bahamas. His father had a large sugar plantation. He died in Boston, and he's buried in Walpole. That's the genealogist in me. So this is so much better on the television. This is Ollie Hartshorn's. She's a little girl, probably Olivia, and you can see her symbol is just a simple infinity symbol. Here is Ruth Kingsbury. This is an urn in willow. The urn symbolizes death, and the weeping willow symbolizes grieving. It's the most common stone we have here in Walpole. This one is little Joseph Hawes. He died when he was almost 3. His parents, instead of having a standard picture on the lunette, opted for a portrait of their son. So this is the stone carver's representation of what little Joseph looked like. There's two, actually, Tree of Life, which I think is a wonderful graphic kind of picture. And then down here is Daniel Clapp. He has several Masonic symbols on his headstone, obviously indicating that he was a Mason. So I believe the G stands for God. There's a half moon here. There's a sun here, a trowel. And then there's more symbols down below that I didn't catch. I was trying to get the lunette. So the cemetery on the corner of Main Street and Kendall Street, the old burial ground, is only so big. It couldn't expand any further. It had streets on 2 sides and homes on the other 2 sides. So about the same time, 2 other cemeteries were established here in North Walpole. The Maple Grove Cemetery, which is a little bit further down on Kendall, and then Rural Cemetery, which is kind of behind where Scoops is today, off of, if you went up North Street. You can see from this picture, it's on a hill. This is also on a hill. It goes up this way. But the earliest burials are the ones down in front. So here, and then all of these stones in here. So these people are buried at the bottom of the hill, not at the top of the hill. So that really shows a changing belief in religious belief here amongst the Congregationalists that lived in Walpole. So they didn't need to be at the top of the hill, and neither of these cemeteries, the people are buried in an east-west fashion. Make sure I hit all of the things. So the winged skulls, I knew I had it. The winged skulls represent a soul-fleeting mortality. The winged cherubs represents the spirit of the dead going to heaven. The crossbones symbolizes death and the passing from life. Sometimes we see an hourglass, which would represent time is short. Sometimes we see a sun. There is a sun in one of the cemeteries here, which is eternal light of heaven. And the tree of life represents life, longevity, and immortality. So more about these cemeteries. About 20 years after they were established, no less than that, 15 years after they were established, Mount Auburn Cemetery was established. And it was set up to be like a park. It had wandering paths. It has beautiful monuments. It has noted trees and bushes. It has ponds. It was supposed to be a place not only where you buried your dead, but where the living could come and enjoy it. It was park-like. We don't have anything here in Walpole that's comparable to the Mount Auburn Cemetery, but when you study these cemeteries, you can see that they kind of tried to make them feel garden-like. In fact, Rural Cemetery was called the North Burial Place, and now it's called Rural. The other name for this garden movement was the Rural Cemetery Movement. And they laid out lots of paths There's no ponds on them, but there are some trees and plantings that are beautiful and make you feel like you're in a garden. So more on symbolism. These are some stones from the newer portion. So when we stopped using slate to be carved, marble became very, very popular. I like to think that it was bright white, and when it's against the green of the grass and the cemeteries next to the gray stones, it had to have just popped from a distance. And marble was a much softer stone. It was so much easier to carve. And you start to see some really elaborate carvings on these stones. So this is Abby Sherman. Her hand is pointing up, which is reminding us of heaven, right? And that we need to live a good life, and that she is in heaven. There's a hope for you to be in heaven. And then these are the Smiths. There's actually more of them, but I've selected these few. So this is husband and wife, father and wife. So James and Sarah, hands are shaking. Sometimes it's we'll meet again in heaven. Sometimes it has to do with not being separated by death. You're still together. And then this is their daughter, Louisa. Her hand is pointing down, which is makes us think about God reaching down for the soul. But she's also holding some flowers, and the different flowers have different meanings. So it's really difficult for me to figure out what they are, but I do know. So these look like forget-me-nots to me. And this is Lily of the Valley, but I'm not sure if this is a tulip. It hasn't bloomed yet, which would show that Louisa died before she fully blossomed. And then symbols on children's gravestones. So one of the problems with marble, and we really don't use it anymore, is that it's so soft and easy to carve, which is a positive, but it erodes. These two stones have lambs on top of it, which would be a symbol for purity and innocence. Usually you see them on children's headstones, and indeed these are two little boys. And then this stone is Josephine Piper. She has a rose, again, cut down before she could blossom, but the rose stem is difficult to see, is also broken, so she was cut short. So around 1850, granite becomes a popular stone, 1850, 1860. And the reason it hadn't been used before, because if you've done any yard work here in Walpole, you know we got a lot of granite. It's really a strong stone. It was difficult to cut. And by the mid-1800s, they had started to invent ways of effectively carving granite. And we start to also see a family monument versus individual headstones. So it would have the family name on it, and then the names of everybody carved on the front or the back of who is buried in that spot. And the Victorians also really loved these large, ornate stones. So this is the McEwen family stone, and this is an urn, which symbolizes death, like the urn in Willow. And it's draped with a cloth, indicating the veil between life and death. This is James A. Lewis. All of the stones, there's individual stones that are just curved and simple. His family is buried there, but his stone has the cap and the bugle on it. He served in the Civil War as a bugler, and his family decided to memorialize him in that way. And then this stone here is Isaac Newton Lewis. He was our historian around 1900. This is his family stone. The stone itself looks kind of like an altar, and the book represents the Bible. In fact, there's a Bible verse engraved on that open book. But the other strange thing, or interesting thing, I would say, about his family's burial plot is there are 44 of these VA-issued stones that encircle the lot. And it has the names of Revolutionary War soldiers from Walpole. He researched them, and then he applied for their headstones, and he put them in his family plot as a memorial for our veterans who fought in the Revolutionary War. And then this monument, this picture does not do it justice. It has got to be 15 to 20 feet tall. It is huge. And that's the family of George A. Plimpton. So it's an obelisk, and if you look at it, it looks like the Washington Monument or our Bunker Hill Monument. So that was a popular style, and it represents Ra, who's the giver of life. So in these two cemeteries are buried men who helped Walpole grow into a town. They opened businesses. They weren't just the farmers and the laborers. So here we have Harlow Lawrence and Horatio Wood. They're buried at Rural Cemetery, and they owned a cotton mill. Their mill was located right where the Kendall Mills used to be. In fact, that was initially the mill that was there. And they made cotton thread. And then this is John Blackburn. He was a cotton manufacturer. He was the first person to come to Walpole and open a cotton manufacturing plant. He made cotton fabric. His mill was located in what is today the Walpole Woods. So this is Willard Lewis. When Horatio Wood and Harlow Lawrence sold their business, Willard Lewis bought it, and he retooled and made the factory bigger, and he made what they called cotton batting, which would be used for padding in chairs and cushions. His house is the Walpole Historical Society's house today. This is Henry Plimpton Kendall. He took over the Lewis Mill as a young man and got rid of some products that were not necessary and began creating products that people wanted. During World War I, they made cotton bandaging. I know him because I'm diapered my children with cloth diapers, the Kendall diapers. He grew the company from a company that employed about 25 people here in Walpole when Willard owned it to a multi-million-dollar international company. And then over here is Eleazar Smith. I could do a whole talk on him. He was an inventor. He was born and raised in Medfield, and when he married, he lived just over the Medfield border on High Street. He invented a lot of things, starting when he was really young. I think the amazing thing is he was born in 1755. And he was really into machinery, gears, and how things worked. And when you think about 1755, or maybe when he was 15, so 1770, mechanisms were not something that we really use. Machinery wasn't a thing, right? The Industrial Revolution hadn't occurred yet. The businesses that were here in Walpole were really small. So we had a lot of mills on the Neponset River, but probably employed anywhere from 1 to, say, 10 people. So Eleazar, his first invention was he made a watch. And he was 15, and he had 3 tools. He had like a penknife and a compass and something else, and he made a watch that really worked. And he gave it to a man in Norfolk, and the man in Norfolk was so impressed that he bought tools for Eleazar so he could continue to make and repair watches. And it was something he continued to do the rest of his life. When he was 16, he invented a machine that made 1,500 pins in a day. But the only problem was they all needed to be hand pointed. So, right, that would slow the mechanism down a bit. When he was 17, he made a gun. And he used that gun for practice in the militia, the Minutemen. In fact, he was a Minuteman. And he served a couple of tours in the American Revolution, but not too successfully. And so when he married, he lived here in Walpole. He continued to invent things, but what he was really known for was a machine that made cards. So I kind of think of it like the old IBM business cards, not business cards, the cards that poked the holes, right? And then it fed it into the computer, and then the computer knew what to do by the holes. His was, he used pins that stuck up on a piece of leather, and those pins told the machine how to weave a design in a fabric. The problem with Eleazar was he liked to talk. And he would maybe go to downtown Walpole or Medville, and he'll say, I am inventing this really cool thing. I'm doing this, and with the pins and the card, and the person would say, And how does that work? So he told an awful lot of people about his inventions, and they filed the patent on them. And he didn't. He didn't get the patent for his own machines. He lived in poverty. He would hire himself out at harvest time or for other jobs, small jobs that he could do. So then we have the peacemakers here in town, and we have quite a large group of them. I do know, we know that Lawson Gray had a safe house here on the Underground Railroad. So this here is husband and wife, Asha and Joseph Engley, and they lived here in Walpole. Joseph was a shoemaker, and they were some of the first people to really create an anti-slavery society here in Massachusetts, several years before a national one was created. So, So Joseph Engley was, he left his church. He was a member of the Orthodox Congregational Church, which was on East Street, kind of where I think it's Farmer in the Dell is that right? And he started this movement here in town. He was very involved, as I said, in local anti-slavery things, and he tried to get the church to come along and stand up and say, hey, slavery is wrong. And the minister wouldn't. And so he stepped away from services, and he actually wrote a letter to the Liberator that was published saying, you know, if the church is not willing to say slavery is bad, then they're supporting slavery, and I can't stay. His wife, Asha, left a couple of months later in support of her husband. She actually was the Walpole Women's Anti-Slavery Committee president for a while. It was really hard for me to tell the story of women that lived here in Walpole. It's so all about the men. And then this is Lawson Gray. They were actually neighbors. They lived over on Spring Street. Lawson, as I mentioned, had a safe house on the Underground Railroad. He was a master mason and was responsible for building the Hollingsworth and Vose buildings, as well as some of the Bird Mill buildings. His house is gone now, but he was very active in the Norfolk County Anti-Slavery Society, often assuming leadership positions. Lawson was one of the delegates from Walpole who attended an 1840 convention of the American Anti-Slavery Society. In 1841, he had a letter published in the Liberator condemning the excommunication of a church member for his anti-slavery convictions. I believe that would be Joseph. By stating that the minister allowing this to happen supports slavery. In 1848, he was chosen the vice president of the Norfolk County Anti-Slavery Society. So here in Walpole, we have 4 small family burial sites. This is the Morse Burial Ground. It's at the end of West Street, where West Street kind of comes into Norfolk. There's 5 people buried there, a father, son, their wives, and a daughter/sister. 2 Revolutionary War soldiers. This is a map, an old map of Walpole. Here's West Street. Joseph Morse and his brother Jotham Morse, their houses still stand. And when you get to the end of the road, which would be down here, I didn't snip and cut this picture, would be the intersection where their cemetery is buried. In the town forest is the Blake Cemetery plot. Aaron Blake was a miller. He had the first mill in the forest, which eventually John Blackburn bought. And their home was there. Their chimney breast still stands in the forest. In the 70s, someone knocked down all of the antique headstones. They're in the basement of the Historical Society, so they can be seen. And in the 80s, they erected some new stones there. And recently, they put this fence around it. And also in the 70s, someone burned their house down. So then this is Hannah Hartson's burial tomb. This is then the DPW parking lot off of Washington Street. So here is Washington Street. This is South Street. And where it says Hartshorn, Lewis Hartson. So anyhow, Hannah was widowed twice. Her first husband, Benjamin, is buried in Old Cemetery, along with some of her grandchildren. And her second husband is buried down at Terrace Hill. But from looking at the records, it appears as though this land may have been her first husband's land. And her son, Lewis, had a house there and raised his family there. And I'm imagining that Abigail lived with them, and she thought that this piece of land was the most beautiful piece of land in Walpole, that she had her son build this burial tomb so she could spend eternity in a place that she thought was the most beautiful place in the world. And today, it's in the middle of the DPW parking lot. In fact, I was talking to one of the 2 Dans who takes care of the cemeteries, and he said, yeah, we had to fix it because we think someone hit it with a snowplow. And they wanted it to look nice for us. The DPW has done a fabulous job making sure that the cemeteries were photo ready. And the other small cemetery is the Guild Family Cemetery. It's at the end of Common Street and Old Post Road. It turns out across the street from Sharon, I knew that it was close to Sharon. And we set up our table right here at the entrance with our umbrella so people would see us, maybe stop and ask a question. Well, the people that lived across the street were like, what's going on over there? So they came over and we said, yeah, cemetery tour, Walpole's 300th anniversary. And then they said their house across the street was in Sharon. And I'm like, I knew Sharon was close, but I didn't know it was that close. But anyhow, this was Nathaniel Gild's family. He also had a mill. He had a foundry just over the border in Sharon. And in fact, during the Revolutionary War, he asked the government to allow his workers to stay and not go off and fight because they were making bullets and casings for the war, and that they were more needed at home than on the lines. But his son, also Nathaniel, and his grandson, also Nathaniel, they did go to the Revolutionary War, and they are buried there. So the next cemetery I'd like to talk about is the Terrace Hill Cemetery. It's in South Walpole, and I thought it would be kind of interesting. And again, you see it's on a hill, but all the first original burials are down here in front, and it goes up to the top. So it also represents a change in the change in religious beliefs. It was established about 1787. Jonathan Boyden gave a plot of land to start a burial ground. There were several people that were buried there before it was a burial ground for Walpole. In front of this cemetery, so where I took this picture, this was behind me. But this is the Jackson Memorial. It was built in 1905 by Albert Jackson as a memorial for his family. What I read about it was fascinating. It is really tiny on the inside. It has a cathedral ceiling with exposed beams. There's a fireplace in it, which was used for heating. And there were pews. The pews are gone now. And if you walk around the back of it, there's an entrance at basement level, kind of dug out. And it would have been for the hearse to back up. And the coffin could be taken out. And there was a lifting system. So you'd place the coffin on this lifting system and crank it up, and the coffin would come up into the chapel. My friend Annie and I were really fascinated by this, and we reached out to the town of Walpole, and they actually opened it for us. Sadly, I didn't put pictures up here for you to see. We're hoping that maybe we can work together, Annie and I, and maybe get some grants written with the town and possibly get this renovated. But the stone was handpicked for color and size. Initially, it had a slate roof and a copper edge that went along here with two fancy finials on either end. It really was quite pretty, and it's sad that it's a garden shed now, basically. So anyhow, I thought the interesting angle to talk about the Terrace Hill Cemetery would be to talk about the settling of South Walpole, but that's really tricky because when you find a book on the history of Walpole, it talks about all the history and all the corners of the town. It doesn't pull out one little community, but I've lived here for 30 years, and whenever I drive through South Walpole, the end of Washington Street, I feel like I've come to a little sleepy village. So there was a couple of mills here. The Smith brothers, we saw James Smith with the skull and crossbones. He was one of the first people to settle in South Walpole, but the cemetery wasn't there, hence that's why he's up here in North Walpole. He was a bloomer. He came with his brother and his brother-in-law, and they founded an iron foundry, so there was iron ore in South Walpole. And as we went along, let's see. So here are the Millers. So we met James Smith, but this is the Mann family. Theodore Mann came from Wrentham, probably the section that is Norfolk now, near the Pondville area. The Theodore Mann Sr. didn't live in Walpole, but when he died, he left his estate to his son, also Theodore. And so I'm guessing that this house, which still stands, was built about that time. So let me see. So this Theodore died in 1870. This is Theodore Jr. So he probably built this house, and he had a mill there. And then this is his son Timothy, who was a Revolutionary War soldier. And this is an image of the mill area. It's clearly not in the 1700s. The other millers that lived there were the Bacon family. William Bacon came from South Dedham, Norwood, and his daughter here, Hannah, is one of the first two people buried in the cemetery. He operated a grist mill and a wood mill, a sawmill, and just up on Neponset Street. So before you cross over the railroad tracks, there's a little road, and actually it takes you in front of the Timothy Mann house. And if you keep going back, there had been, I think Bird had been back there. That was where William Bacon had his mill. So these are some people who grew the village. There were the farmers. So this is Jonathan Boyden. He gave the land to start Terrace Hill Cemetery. And this is his brother Benjamin. He gave the land to build the first school in South Walpole. It was used for... Well, I know a new building was built about 1850, and then that was used for about 75 years before they built the new Boyden School where it stands now. But the little piece of land that Benjamin gave was where the Jackson Memorial sits now. And then in South Walpole, we had two taverns, and they were literally across the street. This is the Polly's Tavern. It was torn down in the 1960s to make a parking lot for the church that's there. I think it's a Baptist church. And so all I can think of is they've paved paradise and put up a parking lot. And across the street is the Fuller Tavern. And you would think, two taverns across the street? What? So about 1805, Washington Street was opened. It was the Norfolk-Bristol Highway. It replaced the old Norfolk-Bristol Highway, which was Main Street, came right through here, through the center of town. And there was, Walpole is about the halfway point between Boston and Providence. So it was a welcome stop. It took about 8 hours from beginning to end to travel from Boston to Providence. And there were lots of taverns along the way. But the Fullers and the Pollys came to a decision. The carriages that were going into Boston would stop at Polly's Tavern, and the carriages that were coming out of Boston going to Providence would stop at Fuller's. And there was enough business that it was okay, that worked that way. So a lot of people in South Walpole that were raised there and educated there went off into the world and left their mark on the world. I want to talk to you a little bit about Charles Leland. He has one of the most beautiful stones there. You can see it's carved in marble. It's still in pretty good shape. It's tinged gray from pollution. But he died when he was, I think it says, he's 18 years, 1 month, and 9 days. I think he was more than 1 month. 11 months and 19 days. He was killed in the Revolutionary War at Gettysburg, and his body was brought back to Walpole to be buried. And on the back of his stone, that is the names of all of the battles he participated in. Cedar Mountain, Thoroughfare Gap, Bull Run II, South Mountain, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, and Gettysburg. And I want to remind you, he died just shy of his 19th birthday. That was a lot of battles. And the iconography on this stone clearly shows that he was, in service of his country with the shield. And we have laurel wreaths, and we've got a flag, a draped flag. It's a beautiful stone. And we also have the Blake Mausoleum. This is their family stone at the very top of the hill. And the mausoleum was built about 1805 for Dupuy Blake. His son Handel built the mausoleum for his father. And however, his father had erected this stone at the top of the hill and got rid of all the foot markers where everybody was buried and just had one big family stone up there. And Handel thought it would be nice to be able to move his mother and his stepmothers, and he had a sister, baby sister, buried up there, and he would have them all reinterred at the Blake Mausoleum. But because his father had removed all of the stones, they didn't know where anybody was buried. So there are about 5 spots left in this Blake Mausoleum, but you have to be a Blake to be buried there. I do want to tell you about Dupuy Blake. He was a musician. He was a musician of note. He showed a proclivity for music as a little boy and was given piano lessons by some well-known teachers. He worked for a publishing company writing music exclusively for them, and for a while he sold pianos in Boston. It was a venture that did not work out for him. He had to file bankruptcy, but he still was writing music. And when his contract with the publishing company ended, he continued to write music for himself. And he wrote one song that I know you all know, and I know your parents sang it to you. I know you sang it to your children, your grandchildren. I sang it to my children. It goes like this. Rock-a-bye baby on the treetop. When the wind blows, the cradle will rock. That was him. He was a Walpole kid. I love fun facts. So this is the Plains Cemetery. It's out in West Walpole, which is way out on West Street, right? No, Norfolk Street. And it was established in the late 1700s as well. I'll get you the right date. Oh, see, I'm doing this all off the top of my head. All right, so this is the second oldest cemetery here in town. It has approximately 150 headstones in the cemetery, with a little bit of over 300 people, according to the stones, buried there. The cemetery has 2 distinct sections, an old section with the slate tablets and a new section. This angle, I took this picture, you can see all the new granite stones there. It is believed that this area was set aside around 1720, so just before Walpole was established as a burial place. However, the first recorded burial is Deborah Smith in 1731. In the oldest section, the headstones are mostly slate tablets. Some do have their corresponding footstones. And in the newer section, as we mentioned, the granite family stones. In May of 1803, the cemetery was enlarged to reach growing demands. And then again, it was enlarged again in 1883. And it stretches all the way out to Norfolk Street. So in 1905, Isaac Newton Lewis, we saw his family's memorial. They're buried in Maple Grove, and he has the 44 headstones from the buried around him. He was concerned with the decay of not only this cemetery, but all of the cemeteries in town, and he formed an association to protect these cemeteries. He built this tomb here. It's a receiving tomb, and he planted a bunch of maple trees, which were taken down about 15 years ago because they were so old, they were in danger of falling on the stones. And the town of Walpole took over maintaining the cemetery in April of 1962. So the word plains, according to several online dictionaries, is a large area of flat land featuring gentle slopes with a few trees. And if you've ever been to West Walpole, you can understand how this area got its name. Originally referred to as Easy Plain in early Walpole and Medfield records, the cemetery reflects the early name of the area. Today, this neighborhood has remained relatively unchanged since it was first settled in the 1700s. It's still largely agricultural. An odd thing about West Walpole is no village actually sprung up there, right? So people in North Walpole would go to the center of town, and East Walpole has a village-like area, and South Walpole has a village-like area, but no village in West Walpole. And I theorize that they were close enough to come to Walpole Center or Medfield Center or North Wrentham Center, if there was one. I haven't done a lot of history on North Wrentham, but today we call it Norfolk. So it may have just been easier for them to travel to those sites to do their business. We do know most of the people that are buried there were members of the Congregational Church here in Walpole. This is the Catherine Guild receiving tomb. So you will find receiving tombs in all of the cemeteries. Yeah, except for the small ones. They were a place for the dead to be stored because if you died in, say, February, a grave couldn't be hand dug for you. And so the bodies were kept in these receiving tombs until spring when a grave could be buried. Today, the DPW uses them as garden sheds. Catherine Lewis Guild was the wife of George Guild. They're buried down here at this end. So this is at one end, and this is at the other, very far other end. And I found it really curious. I didn't know why they named the receiving tomb after Catherine Guild. She is a Lewis, but a very, very distantly related to Isaac Lewis. And when I gave the tour, someone said she was the first person to use the tomb, and so they named it after her. So some of the families in the Plains. This is Jonathan Boyden. We met his sons, Jonathan and Benjamin. They moved to South Walpole and were helped establish South Walpole as a village. He came over the border from Medfield. He was here. His 4 children, their births are recorded here in Walpole. And in fact, if you know the area, if you go out Granite Street, eventually it runs into 109 in Medfield, and his house, his childhood home, still stands. And it's not exactly at that intersection, but it's within viewing distance of that spot. So then this is Timothy and Mehitabel Morse. Their son Jotham is one of the people that is buried up on the small cemetery at the corner of North and Norfolk. They were the first people that were settled in this area. Timothy was born 1687, I think. This was a second marriage for his wife, Mehitabel. She married Aquila Robbins. She came to the marriage with 3 children, and together they had 4 more children. But there's some really big gaps, and I think that there might have been more children. So the fun fact from this cemetery is Mehitabel Morse is Caroline Quiner Ingalls' great-great-great-grandmother, or Laura Ingalls Wilder's great-great-great-great-grandmother. So I loved those books growing up, so I thought that was kind of cool. And that's the genealogist in me. I find these really weird things. This is Jonathan Hidden. He owned a tavern, which is referred to today as the Hidden Tavern, although it has nothing to do with you can't find it. It's a surname. He owned it during the time of the American Revolution. There were several other owners of the tavern, and then an owner of it after he sold it and before it went back to being a private home. It still stands on Lincoln Street, originally called Back Street. In 1775, General George Washington marched from Boston, and he came right through Walpole on his way to New York. He was concerned that the British might try to take New York. He stopped in Walpole, and then he stopped out here at the Hidden Tavern, where it said Zilpha Boyden Smith gave him a dipper of water. And if Betsy Dyer has a wonderful presentation. I don't know if she's given it to you already, but Walpole during the Revolutionary War era. So this is, my camera didn't work when I took these pictures 18 years ago. So these are the original stones. You can see what I like about them is there's just initials and a date, SS 1739, I believe. And this is DS 1731, and this is another DS, and he's like 1741. And I really took a while to try and figure out who they were. But they're the Smith family, Daniel and Mary Mason. Daniel Smith and Mary Mason were Medfield kids. They married there, and they moved here, like the Boydens. And their 5 daughters their births are recorded here in town. Daniel died, so 2 of their little girls died as infants. Daniel died shortly thereafter, leaving Mary with 3 little girls. 2 are buried there. She remarried a man named, I think, Jonathan Hawes, and it took a while to figure out. So she has a proper stone. It's covered in lichen, and it's a winged cherub, and they are tricky to read when you have this lichen on them. But it took a while to figure out who she was too, and so now I know that she is his wife and the mother of these 2 little girls. This is Zilpha Boyden. I just mentioned her. She was about 18 years old when George Washington came through town, and she offered him a dipper. Her family lived over on Back Street. And if you are zooming down Norfolk Street, you might notice this little piece outside. It's at the very end of the cemetery. You don't have to turn down to see the Plains Cemetery. It's another Revolutionary War memorial that Isaac Bradford Lewis erected. These are, I think there's 7 stones there, and they are the names of men from that area, not just Walpole, but some from North Wrentham, now Norfolk, Foxborough, Franklin, and so they have memorial stones there. There's no one buried there. So I didn't do a big deep dive on the Charles Sumner Bird Cemetery. I did transcribe it 18 years ago. The Bird family owned it, took care of it for many years. This is Francis William Bird I. It's their family headstone. And here is a map I found. So here's the original cemetery. It was originally in South Dedham. Their minister, Thomas Balch, recorded the first burial there, which is Elizabeth Fuller. She was buried there in 1827, and he and Reverend Balch called it the New Cemetery. And what I find kind of amusing is in 1852, the border between South Dedham and Walpole changed. And all of these people that were buried in South Dedham were now lying in Norwood. So this section here was added in the 20s by Charles Sumner Sr., and his son Charles Sumner Jr. added this cemetery. You can see this. This section. It's 9 acres. It's one of the larger cemeteries here in town. It recently was renamed the Charles Sumner Bird Memorial Cemetery because his family's involvement with it. But you can see here by the photograph, there is the East Walpole Cemetery, its old name, with the town marker, Norwood here, Walpole there. I believe it's still privately owned. So thank you. Do you guys have any questions? Yes?
Could you tell me where on Norfolk
Okay. So I still get names of roads mixed up. If you go down West Street and you go past LaRusso's Gravel, and then you come to Norfolk Street, if you sat right there and looked up the hill, you would see it before you looked right and looked left and went in other direction. And that was part of the Morse land. Yes. The bird cemetery is in East Walpole on Pleasant Street, I believe. So, and if there's Walpole folks here who know better than me, please speak up. It is on Pleasant Street. So let me think. If you went past the post office and you went down Union, like you're going to come out onto Route 1, where the Pier 1 used to be, you'll get to a four-way stop. And I think it's a very dangerous four-way stop, if you ask me. And you go left. It's about a quarter of a mile down the road. That's Pleasant Street. Yes. Yes, so the Certainteed is across the street. Yes, sir. Lunette. So, let's see if we can, let's see how clever I am with this. I love this. I'm going to go all the way to the top. So, I love this little headstone. Let me just start the slideshow. All right. So, this section here is called the lunette. This is a double stone. I love this stone, and I love the artwork on it, and it's really tiny. It's about this tall. It's a mother and son. And so this is the mother, the larger stone, and the son is the smaller stone. These are called the shoulders, and up until about, say, 1770, the shoulders were round, and then they became flat. Let's see. Yep, no, all round. Here's a flat shoulder. Nope, that's not a flat. Here's a flat shoulder. And I know I can't, off the top of my head, I can't tell you what the side sections are called. There is a name for that. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You described a lot of the markings and designs on these gravestones.
Yes.
But who made the decision to put them there? Are these people generally left written instructions before their death as to what they wanted?
So that's, I wondered that myself, right? And what I've come to realize is people got what was popular. So I'll put it into, like, if you're redesigning your kitchen now, you'd have the backsplash that's called subway tile is very popular. In the 80s, oak cabinets were very popular, and everybody had to have them. And I think the same is true of the iconography and what the stone looked like. So we do start to see, like, flat shoulders around 1770. It's popular. This was very old-fashioned looking with the round shoulders. I also believe, so your stone carvers not only made gravestones, but they were also the people that carved stone for lintels, over doors and windows. They might have carved the stone for a fireplace. They might have carved cobblestones. So they did a lot of carving. This wasn't what they just simply did. So I think that sometimes the carving was already done. So you would come and you would go, oh, I like that Greek urn, and there was just nothing here. And they would say, well, what do you want it to say? And then they would carve what you wanted. And usually they say, in the memory of the name of the person. Sometimes they put a connection. The wife of Solomon Kingsbury, who was another tavern owner here in town. His house is still standing. It's a medical building across the street from the cemetery. It was renovated like 30 years ago. It's huge now, but they kept the front of it. So I think, if someone wanted something particular, clearly the Haws wanted a portrait of their son. This was a more bespoke headstone, and so they probably waited a little bit longer to have the stone carved to their specifications. Any other questions? Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate it.